Lord, may the words of my mouth and the thoughts, the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I don't know what's changed today. Not only is this leaning, but the words are more blurry than normal, so give me a moment. I've had these down there every time I preach for about the last 6 months, but I don't know why. For some reason, this is the first time I feel I can't see the words without them. And now I can't see the screen. But I can tell you, that's my great Uncle John. That was taken last year. And my great Uncle John was a Spitfire pilot in the Second World War. He was one of the youngest ones. He only flew at the very end of the war. And actually, I'm not entirely sure why. I should ask him. He's actually really pleased that he only ever flew reconnaissance missions. He never actually fired any shots. I think partly because he just started flying at the end of the war there. My great Uncle John was 100 this year. They were going to fly a Spitfire over the garden where his 100th birthday party was, but for some reason they flew 2 Hurricanes instead. I don't know why. Here he is with the other remaining Spitfire pilots. That's them. That's a couple of years ago, that photo. Which makes you realise, doesn't it, that these wars that we remember today are almost passing out of living memory, aren't they? And that doesn't mean to say lots of us aren't affected by them. I think particularly of Sylvia and Margaret, who you might have seen on the photo, whose father died in the war. But for all of us, our families are different because of what happened in those years. And yet, the wars themselves are beginning to pass out of living memory. And so there's a discussion going on about what does remembrance mean, this time of year, these days. What do they mean for us now? And like this, we've done today, we remember other people serving in the forces, we remember other wars, and probably you're thinking about war in the world right now because it's so present to us, isn't it? So much on our TV screens at the moment. And yet, there's maybe something about the 2 world wars which still remain a significant thing in our collective public consciousness. Those stories still often fill our novels and our TV series and our films. And actually you hear the wars referred to again and again in political dialogue and in lots of other ways too. And maybe that's partly because in those times there were ordinary people, a lot like us, who ended up making extraordinary sacrifices, and perhaps we explore those stories, that perhaps they make good plots for films and books, because we wonder, would we have been able to do that? These people who were presented with this moment where they had to risk their lives for the sake of another person, for the sake of a greater good. So you get these 2 generations, the generation of the First World War, the generation of the Second World War, because of the accident of their birth, because of when they were born and where they were born, find themselves willing to lay down their lives for a cause that's bigger than their lives. These people who might otherwise have been unremarkable people find themselves in a situation which causes them to make these remarkable sacrifices for the sake of the common good. They were presented with these exceptional circumstances, which meant they had to place their lives in great danger. And what we're doing today is recognizing how thankful we are that they were up to it. And that thought of ordinary people like us being willing to sacrifice so much takes us to the heart of those words that Jesus said towards the end of his life when he sat with his disciples in John 15. Greater love has no one than to lay down his life for his friends. Greater love has no one than to lay down his life for his friends. For Christians, our life is a loan from God. We don't have the final say on it, and that's why Christians get concerned about, or certainly want to ask more questions about things like euthanasia. You know, our life is not something we can take when we want to. It belongs to God. And yet, there are moments when God invites us to choose between our safety, the preservation of our life, and a greater cause. And perhaps in those moments then our fear of death becomes smaller than the joy of obedience, and becomes smaller than our love for God and our love for our neighbour, so that we stare in the face of death and defy it, maybe even laying down our lives. Hang on, I'll just take this off so I can see you again. Good. Just checking you haven't all gone to sleep or you're not all weeping because I've said something inappropriate. You all look fine, that's good. I'll put them on again. I may need varifocals next time round. Although Keith's told me about his varifocals, which make him fall down the stairs. Is that right? Make him feel like he's going to fall down the stairs. So I can't see where he is. Are you here? Oh, he's in creche. Great. Does anybody else want to say anything rude about Keith while he's in creche? No, okay. We also might have concerns, I sometimes do, about remembrance, in that it can sometimes be used to glorify war, or might be used to glorify war. Or you might have other concerns about the way in which it could be politicized. But the deeper thing about remembrance is it brings to light that thing we've just been talking about, that incredible side of humans, our willingness to selflessly surrender our lives for the sake of others, for the love that's greater even than our lives. When Jesus says that greater love has no one than to lay down their life for their friend, that's not just a generic statement. It is a true generic statement, but it's not just generic. He's talking about his own life, isn't he? He's talking about the fact that he's going to lay down his life for the friends who are sat around the table with him. And actually not just for his friends, he lays down his life for those who consider themselves to be his enemies. In fact, he lays down his life for the salvation of the whole world, and we'll say a bit more about that in a moment. The people we're remembering today who lay down their lives, actually we're not just remembering them dying, we're remembering the everyday sacrifices that had to be made in those times. Because the truth is we lay down our lives in more than one way, don't we? There's the ultimate cost of giving up our life for someone else. But there's also the daily laying down our life that comes from laying down our immediate concerns, our immediate needs, and instead choosing to bless other people and their concerns and their needs. The laying down of our life which demands that we curtail our desires and our demands of the world so that other people can experience greater love and greater justice. So Jesus, as he lays down his life, it's not just about that one history-changing moment of his death on the cross. Actually, as Jesus lays down his life, it's about all of these daily, smaller sacrifices as well. Jesus's life is about continually putting others first, about serving others' needs. Jesus lives this self-giving life right the way through his life. He's always focused on others, not only in his death, but Philippians 2, a beautiful poem that Paul quotes in Philippians 2, talks about Jesus who made himself nothing, who took on the very nature of a servant, and he does that at the very beginning of his life and all the way through his life. One of my heroes, a German theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, when he was sat in a Nazi prison, wrote an enormous amount of the most compelling theology. And in one of his letters, he gave Jesus this title, a beautiful title. He said Jesus was the man for others. The man for others. Isn't that just wonderful? In each moment of Jesus' life, he lives for the people around him. He is the man for others. We heard some more about that in those remarkable prophetic words from Isaiah, written several hundred years before Jesus lived, but so accurately descriptive of Jesus' life and particularly his death. They talk more about that poured out life. They talk about Jesus who identifies himself with outsiders, with those who are looked down upon. He identifies himself with the suffering of the world. He subjects himself to the injustice of the world. He's despised with those who are despised. He's rejected. He's oppressed with those who are oppressed. Jesus identifies himself with the pain of the world, with the sorrow of the world. And I believe Jesus still identifies himself with those who are subjected to terror and subjected to war today. In his life and in his death, he takes up our pain into God. He borrows, that's a new word for you. He bears our sorrow. He carries it to God. He experiences injustice and affliction alongside humanity that experiences injustice and affliction. He subjects himself to the oppression of powerful people. Jesus is the ultimate innocent victim in that he has no sin, and yet all the sin of the world is laid upon him. Jesus identifies with the victims of every age. Jesus is scapegoated like so many people are today. Jesus is beaten by the power that people use unjustly and to serve their own aims. Just checking again. It's quite a good visual cue, actually. I might do that again. So the sacrifices we remember today point us to Jesus, who lays down his life for others, and not just in his death. Actually, Jesus, who through the stories we find in the Gospels, is pouring out his life in his everyday encounters too. And not only does he pour out his life, he pours out his life in the way of identifying himself with those who are subjected to suffering, with those who are subjected to injustice. And because Jesus is not just a man for others, but is also God with us, because Jesus is also God with us, which also comes from Isaiah, in Jesus we realize that actually God is in solidarity with those who suffer war. God is with those who are living through the unimaginable horror of their loved ones being held hostage. God is with those who each night put their children to bed, fearing the bombs that might fall on them as they sleep. God is with those who feel they've lost everything, and still every day their future looks bleaker. And because Jesus lives, and because he's at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us, we trust that Jesus is still bringing the suffering of the world, the hurt of the world, to God. Still praying for it, still interceding for it. And as he brings it to God, he's heard, all of that suffering is heard, and it can all be embraced, it all is embraced in God's transforming love. Still okay? So the poured out way of life that Jesus lives, that Jesus' way of life, which is living for others, is not the only way of living. And the opposite way of living is a kind of grasping, self-centered, often violent life. The letter of James in chapter 4 says this: "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire but do not have, so you kill. You covet but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight." That's the opposite way of living for others, isn't it? Those desires in us, following through on them, that self-centered grasping, we call sin. It's sin that makes us want to take from others. It's sin that would make us hate others or wish they were dead. It's sin that thinks we have a right to take people's homes and possessions. It's sin that would make us rationalize taking another's life. The sinful human in aggression, which so often takes us to war, is the inverse of Jesus' life for others. It's the opposite of that. And it's that sin that ultimately results in war. The root of war in the end is sin in the human heart. So what we said so far, Jesus praises this way of living, this poured out life. Greater love has no one than to lay down his life for his friends. Jesus praises that way of being for others. And then secondly, we're seeing that Jesus is a specific man for others who identifies with those who suffer, including those who suffer in war then and now. Is that good so far? There's some comfort in that, isn't there? That's good news. It's not yet fully the gospel, because Jesus is the man for others, Bonhoeffer says, and Bonhoeffer with all other Christians would also say what we've already said. Jesus is not just the man for others, he's also God with us. And the truth is, as God in Christ enters into human sin, enters into suffering, enters into war, he can actually address the heart of the matter. So he doesn't just come empathetically to suffer alongside us, he also comes with a solution to the problems of the world. And he comes to address the problem of the human heart, which is the heart of the matter. He comes to address the sin in us, which causes us to live this turned-in life, grasping whatever we desire from whoever we want, regardless of the pain we might cause them. So Jesus, as he lays down his life, is not only identifying with a sinful world and bringing it to God, good though those things are, more significantly, he's dealing with sin in the hearts of sinners. So the salvation that we are offered in the death of Jesus sets us free from the bondage of sin, sets us free from the sin that results in pain and evil and violence and war. In his death, Jesus sets us free from those sinful desires that James knew about. He sets us free from the claim that sin has on our lives and on our hearts. He sets us free so that we can be turned back to God in him. And in God, then, we find true life and true righteousness. In his death, Jesus gives us another way of life, this outward-focused life, this giving life, this outturned life, where we use our resources not to claim more from the world, but we use what we've been blessed with to bless others, to see them as people we're to serve, rather than competitors who we need to fight with and to take from. Which is a big claim, isn't it? What I'm just saying, so you've all got this. Because we don't see this happening every day, do we? What I'm saying is that in his death on the cross, Jesus is able to heal the human heart of all that then leads ultimately to war. And in here, this morning, we know that not just as something we believe in, we know it because we've experienced it, because we're experiencing it. The salvation that we've received in Jesus has impacted our lives and is changing our hearts. We are being changed by his love. The love of Jesus that we see on the cross really has set us free from sin, really has opened us up to love God more fully, to love others properly. The power of God on the cross, which looks like foolishness, this amazing man crucified between thieves, the power of God that looks foolish on the cross is actually the hope that we need. And it's the hope that the world can be changed, that sin can be overcome. The power of God on the cross is the inspiration that we need to work and to pray for something else that Isaiah saw, The moment when people take their swords and beat them into plowshares, and their spears and beat them into pruning hooks. That moment when nation will not take up sword against another nation, nor train for war anymore. In the death of Jesus, in the healing of the sin of the world that happens in that moment, we begin to work and pray for that future. In Jesus, then, we learn all of these things. In Jesus, we learn how God responds to the great suffering that we see in our world now. In Jesus, we see how God identifies with those right now under oppression. We see how God is close to those who suffer and grieve. And doesn't that stir you that we need to be close to those people because we are God's people too? And we can pray to him for our world that suffers with this extra confidence that in Jesus, God knows just how bleak the world really can be. And in Jesus, God has dealt with all of the desires in our heart which lead us to sin, which lead us to war. He's dealt decisively with those things. And he offers to all people forgiveness of sin, transformation, the promise of new life, a fresh start, a changed heart. The gospel this morning is that through the power of Jesus, through the poured out life of Jesus in every moment and on the cross, through those things we can live out-turned lives. We can be women and men for others. We can stand in solidarity with those who suffer, just like Jesus did. And we can be signs of the new world that is coming, where Jesus reigns as the Prince of Peace, where from pole to pole war will cease. Awake, my soul, and sing of him who died for you. Awake, my soul, and sing of him who died for you.